Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Quictast. My name is Becca Syme, and I am an author success coach specializing in personality alignment. And typically around here, you might hear me doing episodes about questioning the premise of should I write to market or not? Should I edit as I go? Things like that, because we do a lot of alignment for when a particular person has a consistent trait, something that's just going to show up in them no matter what. Are there conflicts to certain quote unquote expectations? And I say quote unquote because they are never actually rules. They're just expectations. They're basically correlations of behavior, not causations of behavior, if you understand what that means. That means that there's enough people that do this thing that are successful that it becomes correlated with success, but it does not cause success to happen. Therefore, if you don't do it or if you are missing it, it doesn't cause you to not be successful. But that's what we think because we don't understand correlation and causation. But anyway, the reason I explain that is because this series that we're doing on character personality alignment has a couple of purposes. One is to help us as writers, screenwriters, novelists, short story writers, poet, like whatever type of writing we're doing. But one is to help us as writers understand what it looks like to write aligned characters, specifically resonant characters. And we've talked before about why resonance is so important. The shorthand is we want resonant, not realistic. We want things that we can believe, that we could believe were true. If someone was telling us the story of something, it would resonate with us, not that we believe is true. So not that we think is reality. That's a very different metric, but something that we could trust or that we don't not trust. And that double negative is actually important because we're not trying to convince ourselves that these things actually exist or actually happen. It's that unconsciously we are monitoring things at all times for how much we can trust them. Just subconsciously, it's a biological urge. It's sort of like a Maslow's hierarchy type of thing. You are not conscious that you're doing it. But what happens when you write an aligned character in particular is that audiences resonate. And if they resonate enough, they will resonate to a point where you'll have an extremely memorable character. And that's who I've been trying to do in these episodes. In the past, we've done some different tactics about how to deconstruct the character's alignment. And I want to try something different today because we're going to do the Diplomat. And specifically, we're doing the whole 2 series arc because I want to talk about how individual characters, when they are more complicated, have an opportunity to show us with an actual arc, like a mini arc, multiple individual aligned character traits. And I want to talk about the 2 main characters in the Diplomat. And we're going to talk about the strengths that were the most visible. So Clifton's strengths is a personality metric, and it specifically tests how you are successful at something. So it doesn't make any assumptions about what success looks like. It does assume that when we see patterns that are consistent enough that people have a collection of traits all together and they appear often enough that if you also have those traits, you're more likely to have whatever causes those traits. And this is an important difference between the correlation and causation. Most personality tests are correlation only because they don't look at a refined enough cluster of behaviors to try to find what the overlap is. And that's not a criticism, by the way. Plenty of personality tests are helpful in different ways, and we talk about several of them around here. We've talked about all of the major ones around here at some point. We probably talk about strengths and Enneagram the most, and those are the 2 that I'm going to mention in this episode. Although I'll only mention the Enneagram briefly because I'm not an expert in the Enneagram. If you want an expert in the Enneagram, go to Claire Taylor. I think it's liberatedwriter.com. But I only want to talk about their Enneagram as one of the potential arcs that you could see in a long-running character. And I'm specifically picking a series where we have a couple of seasons out, but we don't have the conclusion of the series yet, assuming, please God, Netflix, just finish this series. I want to know what happens. They have a habit sometimes of not doing that. But I think this is well written enough and well acted enough and well received enough that I'm hopeful it's going to continue to get seasons written. And it doesn't seem like it's super expensive to make, which is kind of the sweet spot, right, for continuation of series. But anyway, I digress. But I intentionally picked a show that had an unfinished arc so that we could talk about the middles, right, of those arcs rather than the landings, which is what we talked about in the previous episode. But I want to talk about the beginnings and the middles a little bit more because this is where you start to build the complexity of the character. And then I'll give some thoughts about where I think these arcs might land. And I have more thoughts about certain really, really big fundamental drivers for these characters. Because in my mind, when I see a character that's so well developed like this, and this is why I picked Katherine and Hal in particular, is because we see them enough and we have enough data on them over the course of these 14 episodes, I think, or 15 episodes that we have, to be able to see a significant amount of different clusters of traits that they have. So strengths are like little ropes, and the ropes have these individual threads in them, and the threads are these collections of related behaviors. So the cord itself, we'll talk about restorative first. So let's say the cord of restorative is a collection of like 12 behaviors that all are related to each other, that when someone has restorative as a strength, really dominant, they are the most likely to have all of those traits together or all of those skills together. And these skills are developable, of course, and that's sort of the point. The Better Faster Academy is that where you are the strongest, you get the most exponentially better. So you get the most better faster, right? But these individual traits, you see them and they are like carbon copies of the same trait from person to person. They're so predictable. This is why I use strengths in success alignment, is because the way they show up is so predictable. If I know the combinations of the traits that you have, I can predict what's going to make you happy, what's going to make you stressed out. I can predict how you're going to act in certain situations. And the more nuance I have about you, the more I know things like your Enneagram or maybe even your Myers-Briggs or how you identify with the DISC assessment or anything like that, right? Any additional information I have about you, including your background, including, how old you are, how you were raised, all these things all can contribute to that nuance, sure. But there are certain things that, because of the way these threads combine so consistently among humans, and again, the strengths test was developed and again, the strengths test was developed by interviewing huge amounts of people, trying to find these specific trait overlaps and what these clusters were. Because once they realized that you could have these traits that were so significantly better than other traits that you could have, and specifically these trait clusters together, then they wanted to know how to find them, right? So they did a huge amount of research, a decade of research, just trying to figure this out. And what I love about strengths, I love it so much, is that there are no assumptions about things that should occur together. We talked last time about conflicting strengths. You can have strengths that completely conflict with each other. Yeah, chef's kiss. It is such a great program. But the reason I think it's so important in thinking about how to write aligned and resonate characters is because each strength, as predictable as it is, has an arc, right? That a person who has that strength, like we were discussing restorative earlier, it's one of the 34 Clifton strengths. I think it's Katherine's most dominant strength. And usually you're going to see a restorative person, like typically, quote unquote, you're going to see restorative in a grumpy sunshine most of the time, because that is the arc that most easily lends itself to the um, very problem focused, very hyper practical, um, critical, like almost with a negative sort of feel. But the negative feel is a helpfulness, right? It's that I see all of these problems all the time and I want to fix all these problems. But where you typically see restoratives is in grumpy sunshine. So restorative is the opposite of positivity. And you most often see restorative, especially in mini arcs, like in one book or one movie, with a positivity as an opposite. So that's sort of the Roy Kent and Keeley, right, from Ted Lasso. But Grumpy Sunshine in general tends to be a restorative person and a positivity. But seeing restorative as only one strength among at least four that she's got, plus her Enneagram number, and then additionally, she has all of these other complexities that I just haven't seen enough of her behavior yet to be able to map. But she has all of these different complexities that when you have to be with a character for that long, they need to have different dimensions to themselves. So, this is something about those of you who've written longer series, or if you ever write a series for television, you can't have a character that's a monolith. They can't be only one strength. The way that, like, when we were talking about the movie of the Star Trek, the 2010, I think, with Zachary Quinto and Chris Pine. And I talked about how they have a very specific arc for strategic and for analytical for each one of those characters. And they are pretty narrowly defined in those movies. There's less nuance because we have less time with them on screen. But when you spend a lot of time with someone, they need to have dimension and complexity. And the way that these characters have been written in The Diplomat, it is so. There's a reason why when everyone I know watches this show, they just perk up when they talk about it. Because, first of all, I think they do a really good job of setting up expectations that they subvert. So you wouldn't normally see, like, it's not typical, quote unquote, which is annoying that it's not typical because it is so common statistically for women to have restorative and command, which are two of the strengths that she has, but it's not a typical role that you would see a woman play on television because that's not the easiest thing to make a female character, right? So you have to really work hard if you're going to make that female character to make her interesting and likable and understandable because it is supposedly, and again, statistically, this just isn't true, but supposedly there are quote unquote fewer female people who have those types of strengths, who have a command, really dominant, influencing type. But again, the statistics are almost the same. Command in the occurrence with every gender is almost exactly the same percentage. And the reason that's true, and I just don't think people understand how complicated personalities are, but the reason that's true is that there are these 34 different clusters. So you're never going to have a cluster where more than about 18 or 19% of the population has it, a cluster being like a particular strength. And you're never going to have a cluster where less than about 12% of the population has it. And they've tested 35 or 45 million people at this point. So, but again, I digress. The problem is I nerd out about this stuff so much, but I really want to get into the show because there's so much depth here. And specifically, I want to talk about Katherine and Hal and at least four of their core personality traits. But I want to start off with their Enneagram because I think that their conflict in this show, but the core functionality in this show, and you can pretty much pick up any Enneagram book and see how does a 3 interact with an 8, and they will just give you this basic interaction, right? And what's so interesting to me, like this is just they just do such a fascinating job of making the people complex but easy to understand because those core drivers are so consistent. And you may not have words for the core drivers for these characters because you may not know what all the motivations are under their skin. But when you deconstruct their behavior and you look at the why underneath why they're doing these things, and again, why for me, when I'm looking at a character over the course of, say, I think we have like 16 hours of time basically with these people, is that there's a why motivation behind every single action that we take. And every single action is driven by something. It might be biological, it might be psychological, it might be environmental, but everything we do is driven by one of those three things. And in each one of those designations, there's this plethora of different things that might be driving us. And it sort of turns into like a matrix, right? So, but when you have a consistent enough data set where every single time they're in, let's say, X environment, or every single time they are under stress, or every single, right, like where there's so much consistency in the way that their personality acts, that you can see the why, if you're good at deconstructing personality, or if you're obsessed with it like I am. But you can see these whys underneath of their behavior. And when they're consistent and every single time they do this, then it's really easy to determine the why. And so what I did was I'd watched The Diplomat before, right? Like I watched it for the plot, I guess, on the first whenever I saw it months ago. And then when I decided to watch it for this, I sat down with my notes, and every single time something happened, I was coding the behaviors into these, and you can't see it obviously, but I have this note set on the side that is like restorative, context, relator, command, just because these are all for Catherine. And then each heading has all of these different behaviors and my notes under where that behavior might be attributed inside that strength, like what thread that's coming from, etc. And so what's been fun about doing this deconstruction in particular for this series is that the characters are so consistent, almost to a point where it feels like they're based on real people, which is, again, they aren't always based on real people just because they're consistent. Sometimes it's just that somebody's really, really good at writing resonant characters and aligned characters, but to write them this complexly over this long is really, really, like, somebody really knows what they're doing in that writer's room, and it's a beauty to watch. Anyway, back to the Enneagram. So the core motivation behind these two characters, and specifically their what I would consider to be their deepest driver, which are always the most invisible. So their deepest drivers, when it's the thing that's absolutely motivating all of their probably more biological behavior than their psychological, because it's just so deep down inside them. Every one of us has one of these. This is the stuff that you're driven by that you don't know, quote unquote. I don't know why I do this, quote unquote, right? Until you do some really extensive self-analysis or self-discovery, or life just throws stuff at you enough that you figure out, oh, I'm really scared of being unworthy, which is the 3, right? And that's Hals. Not being seen, not being valued or validated, right? That's his. And specifically being validated on a larger and larger and larger and larger scale. And this is something that is not uncommon to see for some of the strengths that he has also, which I want to spend more time on his strengths. But I wanted to highlight this Enneagram difference because you really have to watch the whole series to see the consistency of this pairing and how conflicting it is, because eights fear control the most. That's the thing that they hate the most. But when she met him, because of some of his strengths, she couldn't see that that's what he was trying to do. She couldn't see the consistent manipulation, the, what do they call it? I mean, it's chameleoning in the 3 language, self-abandonment, right? So he's he's never himself. I'm not sure he has a self to be, honestly. Like the way that and as you watch the show continue and you see just how much every single thing he does is a manipulation. The biggest kind of reveal for this for me early in the series was the episode where they're fighting about, and I'm going to apologize, we're going to do spoilers here, so that's just where we're going. They're fighting about how long he had known about the VP pick. And you know that he manipulates her, and you know that he lies to her. Like, you've known that most of the show, if not the whole show. Sometimes because she will physically tell you, like, this is what it's like to be with him. But she's just so attached to him. She can't detach herself from him. But in this fight, she's asking him, when did you know? And he says, a month ago. And 3 weeks ago, they had had a big fight about the divorce. And he had said, call Rick, their attorney, and you can have a divorce if you want one. I'll go quietly into the night, basically. And she asks him, I will do this thing if you can answer me one question truthfully. When you told me to call Rick, because there was crying and there was snot and he was begging her. And then he finally said, call Rick, we can get a divorce. Did you think that we were going to be divorced? And he pauses, and you can tell he's caught in this dilemma of he wants to say no. He wants to say, well, but I don't know that that's true. I genuinely believe that everything he does is just a performance for her. I think he wants her to see him struggling with it so that she thinks he has some kind of conscience when he doesn't. I think he's just absolutely devoid of conscience completely. And he struggles for a second, but it's like he struggles for a second too long. And I don't know that she picks it up, but it feels very much like he's performing for her, even in that moment. And he can't afford to let her know too much that he was performing for her, right? Like he can't just quickly answer because then that would be too honest for him. He can't be too honest with her because the vulnerability terrifies him because he knows that if she knew the real him, she wouldn't like him. She would not be able to stand him. Because if she knew what was really going on, how much every single thing that he does is a performance for her, every single thing is a manipulation of some kind, there is no reality whatsoever to their romance. Like he's been using her since they met, and he will just continue to be using her until she either finally leaves him or they both die, or one of them dies. But he can't afford for her to know that, even though both of them sort of know that he does lie to her and he does manipulate, but I don't think she even realizes the depths of which his just lack of veracity exists. I don't think she has any idea. She has inklings because she sees with her restorative clarity, like, this behavior doesn't line up. That's a problem. This doesn't make sense. That's a problem, right? But she's fixing the surface problems all the time. And she's not, and this is very, very normal for high restorative people. She's so concerned with fixing the surface problem. She's not fixing the systemic problem because, and again, this is where the beauty of her character, she's just so well drawn because her relator has let him all the way in to the very, 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 very inside of the circle that she has. And at some point, I don't know when, because they haven't talked about it yet, but at some point, she moved him away from that super inner circle where he had complete access to her vulnerability. And she moved him one circle out because she doesn't trust him. And relators are all about trust. So when you're on the absolute inner circle, you're trusted. When you're on the circle next, you're not trusted, but you're still very close. And he used to be, you could, and again, this is just the most well-drawn relator character ever because this is the actual dilemma of being a relator is when you have someone that you have loved and trusted and let absolutely all the way inside and they have access to your absolute inner character. But the eight fear, right, is that they fear being controlled. And so she's so terrified of being controlled that once she realized he was manipulating her, she had to move him out of that inner circle. But typical to relators, if she is done with him, he is obliterated. Right? Not just that he will cease to exist in her world because she will have to, but any connection that she has to him, any ability to care for him or protect him from himself, any ability to monitor him would go away because she would have to just completely disintegrate their connection as a relator. And this is the relator door slam that happens, right? So when you're a high relator person and somebody's on your very inner circle and you're going to decide, I am no longer going to move, I'm no longer going to trust that person, then you have to move them all the way out of the circles and on the last circle because relators advance people based on how much they trust them. But on the outside of that very last circle is like you don't exist. out there anymore because they can't afford to worry about you unless you are theirs to worry about. So, in order to get rid of him, she would have to, every single part of her would have to disentangle herself from him. And on some level, I think that would feel like obliteration for her, which is why you see her struggle back and forth with, like, I don't trust him. You can't trust Hal. You can't trust Hal. But there's something about him that she can trust still. And it's weird because I was trying to figure out what it was in the arc, just in watching her relator kind of move through this experience of being in love with this, well, in love with, let's call it having an unhealthy attachment to this man that she can't separate herself from. But with relators, they can only afford to move you so far out unless they're actually going to get rid of you because they worry about you. You become part of their responsibility. You can affect them. Like the closer you get to them, you can affect their well-being. So they can't disintegrate you completely. And she is caught and trapped in this place where he does not have her best interests at heart. And I think this is the key. The reason that it's safe for relators to let people in when they get closer and closer to that space is that the wrong person inside that space can just obliterate you. So you have to be really, really protective of that space. And if you know anything about relators, you understand that's a safe set of boundaries for them to hold. It is not an unhealthy set of boundaries to keep a part of yourself from someone until you know that they're a trustworthy person. And it can take time, or I don't know, there probably are, I would assume there are healthy relators who never really get there because they don't need that person on the inside of their inner circle because not everybody does. Not everyone needs someone in that kind of inner part of their identity where they're completely and totally vulnerable. And I think it is a misnomer to try to set it up for ourselves in the trajectory of relationships. Like if you can't get to that place, somehow you are doing it wrong. I think there just are reasons why people don't get past those gates. And Katherine is the reason why. Because if you accidentally let the wrong person inside that circle, they have power over you in a way that no one else can. They'll make you do things that you would never, ever, ever, ever do if they don't have your best interest at heart. And you absolutely have to wait to let that person in. That's reasonable. She didn't wait. She let him in too quickly, and did not have her best interest at heart and still doesn't. He only has his own best interest at heart. And every single time he tells her he has her best interest at heart, he's lying. And it's so visible. They just have created this incredible pain for her, which is really like, yeah, it's like crack for us to watch, right? Because on some level, this is the relator trajectory that everyone who is a relator understands this fear of having this happen. Or if you've already integrated that part of yourself where you don't fear having someone on the inner circle because you know they're not going to be able to affect how you feel about yourself and your own well-being, or they're not going to be able to make you do things that will make you self-abandon, because the way that unhealthy threes can self-abandon just at the drop of a hat. And again, it's the unhealthy part that's really important. I can't tell yet if she's an unhealthy eight. I think I'm going to need at least another season or two to be able to tell. I think she feels like a healthier eight, except for this one part, right? And you can be pretty high on the health scales with Enneagram. But anyway, we've passed through talking about the Enneagram parts and are full into the trust circles of Katherine. And I want to say just one more quick thing about this trust circle piece before we move on. Relators and woos are opposite, and they often are attracted to each other. And you'll see a lot of marriages of people where one's a woo and one's a relator, and they have this, the relators are more introverted. They have smaller circles of people. Woos tend to be more charismatic. They usually have bigger circles of people. But when woos are unhealthy, so there's again, the basement's unhealthiness is the language that we use around strengths. although I should clarify, I don't think Gallup uses that language anymore, but it's a development term, so it's the most helpful for me just to keep thinking about it that way. But when you have an unhealthy woo, they need you to like them. It becomes a fused part of their personality. If you don't like them, they think that there's something wrong and they want to fix that situation. And they can be very aggressive about it and very deceptive about it. And I think the hard part about that pairing in particular is that you don't always know if the relator's healthy because they don't let you in fast. So you can't always determine whether or not those circles inside are full of basements or not. And with woos, their unhealthiness can get masked so much because they can be really nice and kind at first. And then what you're looking for when you're, the relator who's trying to figure out if you can trust them or not is, do they actually have my best interest at heart? So when it would serve them, for instance, let's say, like using Hal as an example, she is so unhappy around him, so unhappy with him. And if he really loved her, if he really had her best interests at heart, he would sacrifice all of his own agenda and he would just leave her because she is dying from how much she doesn't want to be with him, but she can't make herself cut that cord because they have this really unhealthy attachment. And again, it's the relator. She's let him in too far. And now for him to be gone feels like it's going to obliterate some part of her. And that's the danger with that relator, right? But this is why someone having your best interests at heart is so important. And why, when you have one of these opposing strengths, that you're forming friendships with somebody, you're forming partnerships, business partnerships, you're forming romantic entanglements with somebody, and you know that you have one of the two sides of this opposition, you have got to be always testing yourself for, do they have your best interest at heart? Because if they are not willing to sacrifice their own agenda for you in order to keep you healthy, that's a danger zone. Because if that becomes a pattern, so there's a big difference if it's a one-time thing, especially if the person who's not sacrificing their own well-being is like in a difficult situation or they're in a fear state or something like that. One time is fine. I'm not worried about that. The more of a pattern it becomes, the more likely it is that they don't have your best interests at heart. And this particular pairing is a danger zone when it comes to pairing up with people on either side of that who don't have your best interests at heart. So always, always, always be conscious of that. Getting back to the character. I mentioned just for a second about how the picking of little problems, which is restorative, I think is her most dominant strength. And the frustration with the fact that she's not doing substantive and serious work at the very beginning, like how annoyed she is by the fact that there are no real problems to solve, especially because she has this other job in Kabul that she's been working on solving all of these problems for so many years. She has all of this background. You see her in the very first two episodes where she's so obsessed with having Hal call Daria and he doesn't do it over and over again because, again, he doesn't have her best interest at heart. So he's not going to do things that will make her feel better. He's only going to do things that will make himself feel better. So you eventually see her having to sit down and call Daria and say, please fix this. You can't keep doing this. This is what it's going to cause, right? Restoratives are very systemic in their thinking. They're always looking at these little problems that are on the surface, trying to fix the bigger issue. But often when restoratives are blind to the system that they're in, so they think that they're solving problems that are fixing systemic issues, but then because they're so focused, there are so many problems, they're so focused on all the problems, they miss the big picture. So the metaphor we use for this a lot with restorative is, if you have a cut on your arm and I put a Band-Aid on it, if I'm the restorative person and it doesn't heal, me continuing to put a Band-Aid on it is not helpful. I need to figure out what's wrong with why it's not healing. But the more restoratives get into this sort of problem solving fervor, they miss hey, there's a little piece of bone sticking out of that. Your bone is broken. You need to actually get a cast instead of a band-aid because there's a bigger systemic problem under there. And if they don't happen to have experience with broken bones, this is so important. So many restoratives just don't have the experience that they need to solve the systemic problems. So they can see the problems bother them, but they either don't have the control or they don't have the experience to solve it. And so then that will eventually cause problems of the you need a cast and not a band-aid nature because they're not able to actually solve the bigger functional problems. This is what we see with Katherine and Hal. She can see all of the surface issues popping up all the time and she keeps going after them like whack-a-mole, but she doesn't understand that they need a cast. And the cast is not they need to heal their marriage. The cast is you got to get rid of this guy. He's going to constantly be doing this to you for the rest of your life. He does not have your best interest at heart. But she can't see that, right? Because she's so busy solving all these problems. And I genuinely think that he knows that about her because he does this every once in a while. He does these little picky problem things that it's just like these characters are just so well done. Sorry, I get so excited about it because they're so good. But he does these little picky problem things where he'll, especially a little emotional thing, like his not feeling like he's, the wife in the diplomat situation, or, him trying to get everyone to call him Hal instead of Ambassador Wyler. And he keeps saying things that are picking at her that annoy her a little bit. And it's almost like you can see that he knows if he keeps that restorative busy, she will not be able to see the larger systemic problem. And it's so brilliantly written. And when I tell you, if I was friends with this woman, like the conversations that we would be having about noticing the deeper patterns, right? Like, no, just because there's so much blindness that restorative has to systems that it doesn't have any experience with. And it's so hard to watch because there are so many restorative people who are trying to fix all of these external problems. And they're so busy fixing all the external problems that they don't see the deeper issue. And the combination of strengths that I have, I'm so obsessed with the deeper issues and fixing the core of that why rather than just fixing every single thing that I see. And again, restoratives will do the systemic fixing if they understand the system. They have to understand the system first, understand where the problems are coming from. And sometimes they have to know that there's a deeper system under there. Because frankly, most people, not just restoratives, but people in general, do not understand what the deeper systems are. They don't understand, like, human beings have all of these layers to their motivations, right? It's almost like there's like, and I can't even describe how many there are because there just are so many. And every single thing is driven in one of those three categories. It's either biological, psychological, or environmental. And the combination of those things together, but then in each one of those three, there's proliferations, right, of different ways that you can be motivated, and those including things like the nature nurture question about psychology, right? That kind of stuff, right? There's all these different nuances to it. And then inside each of those nuances, there's another set of nuances. And if you don't understand all of that as a restorative who's just trying to fix problems, or as a strategic, which Hal also is, and I'm fairly certain Katherine is, although it's really unusual to see two people who are that high and strategic who end up married to each other. It's not impossible. It has happened. It's just really unusual. Anyway, if a restorative has seen those layers, then they will go after solving the deeper problems. But I don't think she understands that there is another layer below, the one that he keeps creating fires for her to fix. And for sure, she doesn't see him with this futuristic puppet machination thing that we'll talk about in a second with him, that this futuristic strategic combo that he has, she for sure doesn't see that about him because she's so busy trying to put out all of his little fires and respond to every little machination that he does. It's just so brilliant. Oh my gosh, the writers of this show. Like, it makes me want to have them on the Quictast and interview them about their process because these characters are phenomenal. Anyway, and the complications all are important to each other, like they all interplay with each other. So when you have this relator arc of hers that is affected also by her restorative arc, which is affected also by her context arc, which we'll talk about in just a second, that is also affected by her command arc, that's also affected by her 8 Enneagram arc, right? Like she has all of these interwoven in every single behavior. Like I was basically just sitting there coding everything that she did, and I could put everything into. There were a couple of exceptions just because I think there's a strategic thinking strength there. I can't tell if it's analytical or strategic though. My tendency is to say analytical. She might have both. I have both, right? It's possible. But there were some things that I'm like, that feels like it's not a context thing because context is the understanding of the full picture and then the weaving all of the details together to make a predictable set of expectations. So when you have high context, you tend to be a little bit more of a big picture person and you are able to see how details fit together easier, et cetera, et cetera. But that doesn't always feel like what's going on with her. So almost all of her behaviors, though, can be coded into one of those 5 areas, which is really impressive because, again, it feels so real. Yeah, I'm going to stop. I got to stop. There's an additional dimension to her personality with this context that she has of her ability to see so many things interrelated to each other at the same time, which is very common with either context or connectedness, which is another option for her, where you can see how each individual action is impacting all of these other actions, and then how they fit into this sort of larger scale and larger motivation capacity, especially in like these national ways that she's seeing. That's what makes me think that it's more context is super big picture. But she's able to pick out these little details that are very meaningful to pattern seeking and know these little things about the systems that she's existed in and these political systems and understand how different individuals' motivations are working and then be able to predict their behavior based on that, which again has some analytical tendencies, has some context tendencies. But what fascinates me about this is they've made this bedrock characteristic that she has really integral to different points in the conflict, like in her conflict arc, where she's always the person who remembers that one guy that you had the conversation with, which this is not a context trait, by the way, this is more of an input trait, but that one guy you had the conversation with in Russia who had the idea about the cobalt industry and about disrupting the cobalt industry, right? And she gets really kind of fixated on this, finding this guy because they have this very short time frame. And that ability to pick out these details that matter a lot to the entire system of politics, that if you change it in just this one way, this is a very like restorative context thing, it'll change the trajectory, right? Connectedness. So, what fascinates me about that is she does this in multiple different places. And because she is her background also as a working diplomat, so rather than an appointed diplomat, she's a career officer. So she has all this logistical experience on the ground with all of these different situations that are heightened political, right? And you find that Hal does as well, like you understand that about him. She just has so much capacity of multiplying those traits in that context or that restorative that over time she has become instinctively able to do these things that other people have to go searching down and through paperwork and analyzing things, and she can just come to those, and it's such great evidence of high context. It was so cool to watch. We talked a little bit in the Buffy episode about the strength of command and how unusual it is to see in female characters. And she is one of the best. Catherine is one of the best command, like the most complexly written command people I've seen, where every single part of her command journey is relevant to the story, and it's so rich. Even just from the very first time we see her, she's like, you've got to call this person. You have to tell her to say this, stop saying this, say this. And she has this just very commanding, almost militaristic feel to her, which is so cool to see because it's so compassionate too. And I love that they made that particular trait into something that was more realistic to the way that humans who are healthy, who have command, actually act. That often when we see command portrayed in, especially in fiction, we see it as a very disconnected, disassociated motivation that has no heart to it. And she very clearly she cares about the people in these instances, which is one of the things that makes me think relator or connectedness for her. But she cares about the people, and so the command is compassionate. The restorative is compassionate. She wants to see the people in this country that have been torn apart by partly our fault, right? Like partly the United States fault. And she wants to see them restored and healed, again, restorative. But she specifically has a vision. She has a lot of clarity and certainty about what should happen, which overlaps with the eight as well, right? But this command presence that she has, that general like feeling to her sometimes when she's just giving orders, and she expects everyone to follow her orders. And what's so cool to watch is she's the same with the president, with the prime minister, like with the president, when they have that conversation about the boat in Iran and whether or not he's going to send rescue aid to the boat. And she's just telling him this very, very context heavy explanation for why it's not a good idea to do this. And she kind of gives him orders in a way that he's probably not used to being given orders. And kudos to him for being able to take orders from someone that he considers to be a subordinate when she's clearly so much smarter than he is about this. And he clearly is trusting his experts to tell him what needs to happen. And that's always really cool to see in a senior leader. But she orders around Austin Dennison, the foreign secretary, who obviously he's in love with her. So, like, that's a whole separate conversation. But she orders around Austin. She orders around uh, the prime minister. She obviously orders around her staff. She orders around everyone. Interestingly, the one person she can't order around is herself. She can do it with Hal. She can tell Hal what to do, and when it suits him, he listens to her. But she can't tell herself what to do. She cannot keep herself from having to do things she doesn't want to do. She can't keep herself from being beholden to this set of expectations that she now has because she made the wrong decision in letting this unhealthy three with significance and woo and communication, all of those charismatic, influencing, present strengths, who saw her as his other half. He saw her as the person who would always be doing the logistics and making his life easier, and who would always be. I don't think he saw her at all until he had the falling out with the Secretary of State. I don't think he saw her as his ticket to the White House at all. I think he saw her as his first lady, right? He was going to be the ticket to the White House. This woman will be an amazing first lady. And I think that's legitimately the reason that he picked her to be the target of his manipulation, is because he saw how amazing she was. He saw what a gift she was, and he wanted to use that for his own ends, which just makes me hate him so much, so much. Oh, Hal. Mostly because he's so realistic. He's represented so well, and people like that exist in the world, and they are not often unveiled. there are so many people like him in the world that everyone thinks are so wonderful and amazing. And they're so, and people get so swept away in that charisma that they just are not conscious enough to ask if they should trust this person. They're not conscious enough to see if the motivations line up, if they actually have their best interests at heart. And it's so painful to watch when this happens. And probably the most painful in situations like this, where she's never happy. Like, she's only really happy when she's solving problems, which is very common for restorative, but she's never happy. And she cannot tell herself what to do. She can't force herself to leave this man or make him leave because she's so enmeshed with him. And he's done that to her on purpose because he knows that she won't be able to get away. And it's so painful to watch, but so beautifully done. Like, just for fiction, I would like to never see this happen in real life, because I would like for everyone to just be healthier and not be in their low health levels. But not everyone can do that. Like, not every person is capable of facing the fears that are inside them to a level where they can become healthy enough that none of those, like in the Enneagram, right? The low levels of health or in strengths, the basements, none of those are in control. Not everyone has the capacity, because it isn't just courage. I think we do people a disservice when we say that it's only courage. Not everyone has the capacity. There are certain skill sets that you have to, or the freedom to be able to focus on this, or the privilege to be able to focus on it. Not everybody has that ability. And it's unfair of us to expect that everyone should have that ability, but it would be nice. It sure would be nice. I would just love to not see this particular situation happen to real people, but it does. It happens a lot. It happens a lot. Okay, I have so many more notes. I wanted to talk about Hal's influencing strengths so much, but episode is so long already. But I knew it was going to be long because I had to get through this idea of the complexity of the arcing. So we focused a lot on Katherine, and I just want to say a couple of quick things about Hal as we are ending. I'm not sure I have ever seen a more well-drawn, futuristic, strategic narcissist that is of this particular type, like this unhealthy 3 Enneagram type. I don't know that I've ever seen anyone. The closest that I think I've seen was the guy from House of Cards. But the problem with the Kevin Spacey character from House of Cards is that you knew things about him that no one who is wired like that would ever let you see, because he broke the fourth wall all the time. And he told us certain things about himself that he would never be conscious of, right? Like, if it was actually him in his in reality, he wouldn't be conscious of most of those things, let alone telling anyone about them. So the fact that you knew about them made it sort of like horror, right? Like, you could see the horrific stuff coming, I think, more because of how conscious you were of what a horrible person he was, even though he seemed nice and he seemed likable and he seemed, but you knew he wasn't, right? But I'm not sure I've ever seen a more well-drawn, just super balcony futuristic and strategic, unfortunately, but in someone who's so unhealthy in their core motivation that it makes them too good. And really, Katherine is the only foil for Hal that we are going to get, because everything, he's just such a machinator and he has so much power, right? He's very Machiavellian. He has so much access to power through the control that he can exercise over people. There's just nothing that isn't originating with him. Like, I have very little doubt that when we get to the end, we're going to see how much like Frank from House of Cards he really is. But I don't think we're going to see it, quote unquote. Like, I think for a while, we're still going to be kind of is it poor Hal, and Meg is the one who's pulling all the strings? I just don't think there's any way that's possible because of the way that they have drawn his character as having this super subterranean, just absolute 9 level of health 3 Enneagram, which is the very bottom that you can have. There are only 9 levels. 1 is the highest, 9 is the lowest. Just and again, the problem is he's so excellent at all of these strength behaviors. His futuristic and strategic are unparalleled. He's so far ahead of people. He's thought of so many of these, and he's pushing people down these pathways in ways that they don't even realize they're being manipulated. And sometimes for long, long times, like months of time, years of time, they don't realize they're being manipulated. So he's really excellent at futuristic and strategic, but because it's driven by such a horrific low level, like 3 Enneagram, but on a low level of health, it's destruction everywhere, right? And Catherine even makes this comment to him late in the first season where she says, why is it that every time you get in trouble, your first instinct is to cut one of your colleagues at the knees, right? Like, why is that? And it's like, oh, you don't understand what happens when threes get into the corner of feeling unvalued or unworthy or unvalidated. Like, you don't understand how they flail. Like, you don't understand how dangerous that narcissism is. But I think that's because she doesn't see him as a narcissist. She doesn't see him as having what I would consider to be like sociopathic tendencies, right? She doesn't get that. But it's fascinating to me that she keeps trying to understand him. She keeps trying to figure out if there is a reason for her to still have him in this little 2-second circle space where, like, if the first circle of the relator, the very inner circle, is the most intimate, total access to her, she keeps trying to keep him in this next circle out and is looking for evidence to keep him there. And then he gives it to her, but she shouldn't believe it because it's a lie. And then she can't kick him out because now it's like there's this one line where he's talking about how um, when he goes off with Austin's sister and they go into the lake and they're naked and he's kissing her, and then he can't have sex with her. And he makes this comment to his wife. He's like, well, I went out there and I had this nubile young thing, et cetera, et cetera, but the machinery wouldn't work. Like, it never works for anybody but you. And I had this moment of like, he's performing so much for her. This is such an act for him that he even has control over his own erectile dysfunction. Like, he can make himself not be attracted to someone because he can just turn it off. Right, it is wild to me the level of control that man has over himself because he is so obsessed with being validated. He's so obsessed with having power. It is an absolutely fascinating character study, and it just illustrates this significance in him. And you see that desire in little tiny ways that creep out. Like when they first get to England, he does the whole like, I gotta get out, I gotta let people know you're here. And what she doesn't hear, which she should hear, but because it's under there, but she doesn't hear, I need to start my machinations. I need to go find the important people and start reminding them that I'm here and how important I am, and doing all of these very significant things and having control over everyone, right? And every single thing he says to every person, every interaction he has with someone, except for a couple when I think he's in fight or flight response a little bit. But then he rights himself right away, right? Whenever you see him surprised, he always acts, and I don't know how to describe it. It's like a scared animal, right? He always has that momentary scared animal feeling, and then he writes it very quickly. This actor, I'm telling you, he is a genius. And so is Carrie Russell. Like, both of these actors make this show. The writing makes the show, the acting makes the show, the directing is phenomenal. Like, just all of it is so good. but he has this momentary scared animal look. And then as soon as he rights himself, he gets back into control again. But every single interaction with a person, except for a couple of them, are him trying to get them to validate him. And he doesn't see it because he doesn't know that's what he's looking for. But the actor just plays it so beautifully with so much subtext in the acting. It's really phenomenal. And I can't tell how conscious the actors are of these individual drives like this, but the individual drives are so visible in these people and the way that they've been drawn and acted. It's just, anyway, I'm going to stop waxing eloquent about how much I love this show. The very last thing I have to say is that there is a thread of hope, and I know it gets quashed a tiny bit, but I think it's coming back. I really have hope that it's coming back. There's this tiny thread of hope for her, for Catherine, with this Austin Dennison storyline. And when I tell you the first time, like the first time that he made the comment when they were in his study and she said, I need you. And he responded, like, I know, I feel it too. I can't breathe when you're around me. The way that I just was like, oh, that, like, that's so well done and beautiful because he also, I think, is a relator. Like, I think that he's a relator. We don't see him enough until later in the season. And then they're doing this thing with him in the show, which I can't tell if it's intentional or not, or if it's just me wanting to protect Carrie Russell from literally everyone in the world. But they do this thing later in the show where they're trying to make you think that Austin is also manipulating her, and I just don't know that I believe that yet. So I'll give it some time and wait and see if it's just the writers, creating intrigue, or if it's me being hyper vigilant about Carrie Russell because I want her to end up with him. But that moment in that study, y'all, when I tell you that was better than a romance novel. Like it was just the immediate hit of that resonance of that emotion. I'm like, oh, bro, I have felt that feeling before. Like I understand what that feels like. And I also understood, and he acted this so well when she sort of retracted from it and he was like, oh, geez, sorry, I did not mean to do that. Right. And you have this moment of, holy crap, I just was vulnerable and she's not feeling it. But then it was kind of cool to see in 3 or 4 scenes after that, right? Where she acknowledged, at least in her way, the way she was able, like, oh no, I feel this too between us, and we can't talk about it, right? Like, clearly I'm not your sister, like that moment. But that art little mini arc for them, just yeah, I love that so much. And the whole possibility of her being able to find someone who values her in the same way that Hal does, because I think that's important. I think it's important for restorative people and command people to be valued for what they offer, not just for and what they offer in execution, not just in like, yeah. Anyway, it's so important. It helps them because they are often not valued for those things. So it helps them feel integrated in a relationship. So the fact that he also values all of that about her and thinks that she's magical in all the ways that Hal saw she was magical, but Hal doesn't have her best interests at heart. And I think Austin does. I may be disproven, and I'm willing to stipulate that you never know what's going to happen in TV shows. But if I was writing that as an arc for her, that would be the end of her relator arc, would be learning to keep her guard up long enough that she knows exactly that he is the trustworthy person that she thinks he is, that she's more on the lookout for, do you have my best interest at heart? That she's more on the lookout for, are you being self-serving all the time? Is this always making you look better? Is this always about you or is it about me? And I think she needs somebody who's going to make it about her, which here's hoping, Austin, please, 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 writers, but We all know how TV writers like to not give us what we want. So at this point, I'm anticipating that either they're going to secretly reveal he's behind everything, which I don't think is supported by the first two seasons, or they're going to kill him, which would just absolutely destroy me. But yeah, after I watched the end of the second season, which if you haven't seen it yet, I don't want to spoil too much but I saw an interview that Allison Janney did about the last episode, and that was what made me go watch it. Like, I love watching actor interviews, and they were talking about, she said, this is the only time I've ever thrown a script across the room before when I read it. And she'd read the very last line of the last episode of the second season. And she said she threw the script across the room because she just had never been that surprised before. And I was like, oh, now I got to watch this. And it was just the best. It's the best TV show that I've seen in a long, long time that was brand new. It felt a little bit like the golden age of television again, right? Like it was so well done. Anyway, I need to stop. I have been yammering for a long time about this. Clearly, I have a lot to say about the complexity of these arcs, and I will probably do another episode at some point about arc complexity. But hopefully, you can see some of these behaviors in the characters as well. And if you end up watching them and have thoughts about other strengths that they have or other personality traits that you see in them or anything, please feel free to leave me a comment about it. I always like hearing what people's thoughts are. We are going to do a couple more of these. I'm not sure how many, but I have a couple more planned. We do have some other episodes planned for the future, so I hope that you will return and watch more with us. And for now, everybody put out all of the good vibes you possibly can for season 3 of The Diplomat. All right. Thanks, everyone. I'll see you on the next Quictast. Bye.